Welcome to our special Friday Dispatch podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Isger, joined by Steve Hayes. The podcast is brought to you by The Dispatch. Visit thedispatch.com to see our full slate of newsletters and podcasts, and make sure to subscribe to this one so you never miss an episode. Today, we are joined by McKay Coppins, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of The Wilderness, a book about the battle over the future of the Republican Party. Recently, he wrote a piece entitled The $1 Billion Disinformation Campaign to Re-elect the President, which makes him the perfect person to talk to about the social media wars that have come to a head this week as Twitter has attempted to take on President Trump. We'll also talk to him about his advice for young reporters and follow up on another piece he wrote about, well, us here at The Dispatch. Let's dive in. We are joined again by McKay Coppins of The Atlantic. McKay, protests escalated throughout the night and throughout the country in response to the disturbing video of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. An important and ongoing conversation about race and justice that our nation has not yet resolved. As a reporter, how do you approach this with everything else in the news going on as a long-form reporter, especially?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I approach it first as just like an American, as a person who's experiencing this onslaught of horrible news. And, I think that what's grim about it is how much it feels like history repeating itself, like the feeling of watching the footage from Minneapolis. Just it brought back to mind so much the feeling of watching the coverage out of Ferguson, all those years ago. And these same issues are still so front and center in American life. There has been very little progress. There's been very little movement. So, I think I'm trying to digest it all as a reporter. And I think that this, applies to long form and, breaking news reporters. To the extent that it's possible, I think that you kind of have to pick a lane and focus on it. There are a lot of big, important things happening right now. What's happening in Minneapolis is extremely disturbing and worrisome, and gets at these issues of systemic racism that are really important. There's also a deadly pandemic. There's also the administration's response. There's also a presidential election happening right now. That, there's a lot going on, and at least my approach always is to, figure out where I can be of most, where I can add the most value as a journalist, and then focus there while also amplifying the good work of other journalists. But I'm actually curious how you guys kind of approach this with a smaller staff. Like, I imagine your writers have to cover a broad array of issues. Like, how do you go about covering the kind of hurricane of big stories that's happening right now?
Steve, why don't you jump in on that one? Because our morning newsletter this morning was entirely dedicated to the George Floyd video and the current protests, instead of having multiple stories in the newsletter as we normally do. And I really liked that this morning, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think it felt appropriate given what we all watched transpire yesterday and then into the wee hours of this morning. That felt like the right thing to do. I think the first instinct of any reporter is to want to be there and to be out covering the news. Yep. And it's been, speaking personally, it's been frustrating that there are legitimate public health reasons not to have people out and about. So that's my first reaction. I think maybe one of the reasons you've succeeded where I've failed so often over the years is that I can't ever pick that slice that you pick and dive deep, or I just am not very good at it. And I suppose maybe my role is a little bit different or has evolved over the years, whereas I used to be able to do those kind of deep dives and loved to just get lost in a story and live in the story for several weeks or more. I guess my evolving roles don't really allow me to do that as much as I used to. I mean, I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to try to help keep this all in perspective And to the extent that we can be a voice that doesn't contribute to the hysteria, we want to do that. And, that's an ongoing challenge. I mean, I think you get hysteria coming from a lot of different places. You get hysteria coming from the administration, from the president himself, from his Twitter feed, from some of our colleagues in the media who are sensationalizing some of the stuff, making big deals out of things that aren't big deals. I think that's one role that we seek to play. Now, of course, when there are big moments, and I think Sarah's right, this is a big moment. I think, we never want to be in the business of downplaying big moments or being so straight and calm that we fail to give our readers and listeners an understanding of just how important these moments are or can be. So trying to find that balance, I think, is an ongoing challenge. Is that fair, Sarah?
I think that's fair. McKay, though, just diving in a little further on your role, your evolving career. So you and I, by the way, bond over milkshakes in 2013.
Right.
You've just left covering the Romney campaign, and you were with BuzzFeed.
Yep.
Which is, if journalism is the first draft of history, BuzzFeed is like the first listicle of history or the first tweet of history, maybe.
How dare you? How dare you? I'm still gonna defend the honor of my BuzzFeed News colleague.
No, you know what? Like, that actually was not meant as a slight at all. It's that it's so front edge of what's happening. And now, fast forward, we're still milkshake buddies. And,
although it's been a while, we need to get a milkshake sometime soon.
Well, there's a pandemic going on, McKay. I'm sorry.
And I believe a baby is being born very soon. Anyway, well,
14 days. I've got 14 days. It's like my number one craving at home, by the way, is milkshakes.
Really?
So they're on my mind all the time.
Wow.
Milkshakes. But now you're with The Atlantic, and your ability, or rather you have to really pick and choose what stories you're covering and then do a deep dive. And when you're only publishing, once every several weeks, one of these deep dives, how do you take the news onslaught that you were talking about today and, for instance, make sure it's still relevant 3 weeks from now after you've written several thousand words for Atlantic readers, but also maybe that's the second draft of history?
Yeah,
how do you capture a moment?
Yeah, I mean, look, that is one of the great things, but also one of the disadvantages of this kind of job, which I love, and this is basically my dream job. I always wanted. I mean, even when I was at BuzzFeed, I would always be like begging editors to give me a little space to go a little deeper on a story. I took a leave when I was at BuzzFeed to write a book. This was always what I wanted to do. But I will say, like, right now, Steve talked about getting lost in a story. Like, right now, I'm working on a magazine story that won't come out until like the fall, probably, and is completely unrelated to what's happening in the news right now. And I still do have that reporter's instinct when something is happening. I want to go to where the action is, and I want to cover it, and I want to go deep on that story. So one of the things that I've had to teach myself is, like, there are very good reporters covering this right now, and there are very good writers at The Atlantic who are on this right now, and I don't have to be that person. I think that, when I was covering the Romney campaign, it was my first, one of my first, certainly, job covering a presidential campaign, but my first real reporting job. I had been at Newsweek before that, but was kind of chained to my desk. And so I had gotten used to kind of following the candidate around the country and being there when something happened and covering a beat. And now I don't have that experience anymore. And honestly, it's probably good for, my wife and kids. I'm not chasing every single story around the country, but I still do have it. So, when I'm working on a big piece and something is happening like what's happening in the country right now, I do look for opportunities to, or I try to think about how this affects what I'm working on, but you have to think about it in really long a really long-term way, right? Like my story is going to come out in September, October, right? How will the country look at that point? How will we be thinking about these issues then, right? And so it does kind of push you to get outside of the immediate kind of Twitter cycle, right? And think more long term, which I think is good in a lot of ways. At least it's healthy for me.
Speaking of Twitter and that current war, Steve, McKay has written the definitive piece on disinformation, perhaps.
Yeah, really incredible piece that you did. It's one of those kind of pieces that when you read it, it reframes how you see an issue, and that I think if you do what you do for a living is really the highest compliment.
Yeah, thank you.
And your disinformation piece did that for me. Maybe I've got a bunch of questions about it, but maybe you could just give our listeners a sense of what your thesis was and what you found as you reported it out.
Yeah, well, so what the way it actually started was, I got one of those great, very abstract, broad magazine assignments that you sometimes get, which was, we want to do a story on the Trump campaign. Can you figure out something related to the Trump campaign and maybe their internet strategy? It's like a very broad, and that's not to downplay. My editors are actually very smart about this and helped me hone it over the course of the reporting. But what I decided to do was to create a fake Facebook account. And this was last fall, so it was just as impeachment was ramping up. And I created a Facebook account with a fake name and a kind of profile picture with my, MAGA hat on and my face obscured, and just started clicking like on all the official Donald Trump pages. So his page, the campaign's page, the White House's page, and then followed the Facebook algorithm to follow other things that they suggested. So Ann Coulter was one of them, Fox Business, things like that. So I started following kind of all these different pages. In Trump We Trust was one of my favorite Facebook groups that I joined. And the idea, honestly, was just to kind of keep tabs on what they were serving to their fans, But what I found was that over the course of the next several weeks, as I was following the impeachment hearings, I would kind of do this weird thing where I would be following the impeachment hearings for my day job. So watching the hearings, calling sources, and then later in the day or often at night, I would go onto this Facebook feed and spend time scrolling through what the Trump campaign and the president's allies were putting out, kind of the content they were putting out to frame what was happening. And it was really disorienting. And so what I found was that over time, the more time I spent doing that, the more cynical I got about kind of the information that was being put out, not just by the Trump campaign, but by everyone. Like the kind of onslaught of noise, the constant barrage of like warring headlines and distorted facts and all of that got me to the point where I almost couldn't, like, I started to unwillingly lose faith in the idea of objective reality itself. It was almost like, I don't want to overstate it, but it was really like, I would be like, well, who knows if that's true? What even is true? Who cares? Like that was that kind of that cynicism. I could feel that in myself. And so I started to do some more reporting and research and found that this is actually a very common tool used in political propaganda and disinformation around the world. Scholars call it censorship through noise. And so the idea is that, maybe half a century ago, illiberal political leaders would try to lock up, journalists and shut down newspapers and censor in that way. But in the current era of information abundance, where we have so much access to so much information all the time, the new strategy is to overwhelm the public square with information and disinformation, and so that was kind of what launched me into this reporting, which was realizing that this is a very deliberate tactic being deployed by the president and his allies, but also a lot of political actors right now in the U.S.
Well, and isn't it the case that the Trump himself and some of his top advisors haven't been coy about the fact that this is what they're doing, right? I mean, there was the famous comment that Trump made to to Leslie Stahl back in I think before the 2016 election, where he said something like, I'm attacking you and I'm attacking the media. I'm paraphrasing here. So that when you say bad things about me, nobody will know, that people won't believe you. Nobody will know what to believe. And there was a Steve Bannon quote. I wish I had it in hand. Flood the zone with shit or
crap.
Something. Yeah.
I was avoiding the curse word, but you just went for it.
Well, we're so raw and authentic that way. A lot like Joe Rogan, really.
I think of the Dispatch as kind of like a punk podcast.
Totally.
You guys are
That's what we are.
and
that's what we're going for. My mom will be horrified when she hears this. I will tell you that I actually said it. Mom, I was quoting somebody in my defense. But to me, that's a very interesting place to get as a society, as we think about sort of our national discourse. It's disorienting for people like you and me, and we do this for a living. Like, our job is to ferret out the truth and to try to figure out what's what. Think about what it's like for the average citizen who, feels an obligation to keep up with the news, cares about the future of the country, but doesn't know who to trust. And what's been so interesting over the past really 5 years, as we've seen this information explosion, it goes back further than that, but more recently, is the number of times that I've gotten that question if I'm giving a speech, like, how do I know who to believe? Like, how do I know who to trust? What's your answer?
That's the question I get most often when I give speeches about this or lectures. Like people will come up and ask, like, do you have like a list of trusted news sources? Who should I what should I be reading and what shouldn't I be reading? And I'm always kind of like flummoxed by the question, unfortunately, because I think for us on this podcast, like, we have very high media literacy because we're in the media world. Like, it's not like a comment on our education or character. It's just literally, this is what we do for a living. And so people who don't do this for a living, who are busy with regular jobs, and don't have time to ferret out, like, how is this news source slanting this particular subject? It's really difficult to understand. And for me, this was thrown into especially sharp relief by the coronavirus pandemic, because I don't know about you, but I have people in my life who they're casual news consumers, right? They might listen to the radio, they might watch a little TV, they might click on stories that are in their Facebook feed, but they don't have a good sense of which sources are reliable and which ones aren't. And especially when in these last couple months, as information is constantly evolving, even from the best sources and from public health institutions, even as our evolving understanding of this virus changes the official guidance and the conventional wisdom about it. I've just found that a lot of people I know are just, gravitating to whatever grabs their attention. And so sometimes those are things that reinforce their existing worldview. If you're somebody who is prone to be really suspicious of these lockdowns or of mask wearing or whatever, you're going to find a whole information universe that reinforces those opinions. Or if you're somebody who is really, really scared of the coronavirus and thinks it's going to get much worse than it currently is, you can find a lot of alarmist headlines that reinforce that. And I just have found people in my life, people on Facebook, people I know personally, who are just, amplifying bad information. And it's not deliberate, but they just literally don't know how to separate what's true and false. And my answer is not good, because my answer is always, read a lot of different things and expose yourself to a lot of different things. And that's great for me because I can do this for my job. Right. And I know, not only do I know the various editorial slants that different publications have, I know a lot of the individual writers and journalists, and I know exactly where they're coming from, and I can parse all of that. But if you don't have that background knowledge, it is really difficult to navigate this kind of chaotic information ecosystem that we're in right now.
Can I just ask one quick?
Okay, so through the lens.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, let me do one quick follow up on that. When you dove into Facebook the way that you did, and talking about the sort of self-reinforcing media consumption of so many Americans. I don't know if you saw that there was a Wall Street Journal story a couple days ago about how Facebook contributes to this polarization. Is that true? And if it is there anything that can be done about it? Specifically thinking of Facebook?
Well, Facebook is a really interesting case because Mark Zuckerberg, has actually given this a fair amount of thought and has landed on a fairly controversial position, which I think is actually an interesting one. And I think it's worth debating, and it gets a lot of it's glibly dismissed by a lot of people, but I think it's worth thinking about, which is basically what he says is, we're not, political speech is the most scrutinized speech in America, right? Journalists, watchdog groups, politicians, activists, ordinary people are constantly debating what public leaders, especially what the president says. And there is plenty of accountability for that. So his argument is Facebook should not be in charge of arbitrating political speech. And that should be left up. What we're doing is providing a platform for people to say what they want, and then people can hash it out in the public square. They know, as we've seen in that Wall Street Journal story and a lot of other reporting, that they have research that shows that the way that their platform works and the incentive structures that it creates contribute to more division and polarization. We know that the longer that somebody, I can't remember who did this study, but I remember one study found that the longer a Facebook conversation goes on, somebody posts something and people are responding in the thread, the longer it goes on, the more radical the positions become and the more incendiary the rhetoric becomes. So it might start off with kind of everyone's being polite and moderate, but by the end, people are accusing each other of being Nazis and invoking Hitler. And
I'm pretty sure MTV dedicated an entire reality show to that in the
90s. In a way, that's kind of the premise of all reality TV, isn't it?
Yeah. The real world, when people stop being nice and start getting real.
Well, and so this is the thing. They know it, but they've basically decided that it's okay, that contributing to that polarization and division is worth providing this platform for public discourse. And I think that, there's a lot of different ways we could come at that issue, legislative questions, legal questions, common good questions. But it is just an undeniable fact that the way these big social platforms, and I think especially Facebook, are set up, they have just made the calculus that we're going to allow a lot of public political speech that is harmful to society because it's not our place to arbitrate or to determine what's harmful and what's not.
So then let's move to the other end of the spectrum and what's really, I think, ramping up today. Twitter posted a fact check of sorts on the president's mail-in ballot tweet. It said, had a little link and it said, find out more about mail-in ballots. You could click through and see a fact check that Twitter had sort of put together on the president's tweet. The president responded through a number of tweets about Twitter and then signed an executive order that involved Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Want to learn more about that? Check out Advisory Opinions podcast, where David and I did a deep dive on the legal side of that. And then last night, so all was well, right? The war was over for a time being. Last night, early this morning, he posted a tweet about the George Floyd situation in Minneapolis, and it included the line, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Twitter appended a note to the bottom of that said that it was in violation of their policy against incitement and glorification of violence, but that they were going to leave it up because they thought that it was in the public interest. The White House official account then reposted the same tweet, and that has been taken down by Twitter for violating their policy. you described Mark Zuckerberg's take on this and Facebook's take. He has said, we have a different view of this than Twitter does. You've written about this extensively. So you in particular, I think, have unique insight into how this fight is going to play out and where it's going to go from here, because clearly this is not winding down. It is winding up.
Right. It's being escalated, deliberately by the president for, I think,
and by Twitter. Well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the decision to place that notification, I'm actually on the president's Twitter feed now. What's interesting is if you're on his feed, that tweet is actually completely blocked right now with that thing that says the tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. Then you can click view if you want to see it. So, so which is kind of an interesting escalation even further from what they had done with the mail-in ballot tweet. I think that the decision by Twitter to do that was kind of a response in kind by saying we're not backing down from this either, right? So I think it's interesting that the debate over Section 230. I will leave the legal debate to you, but what I think is interesting is that this is one of those things that the partisan political lines are not that clearly drawn, or at least haven't been up until the president jumped in the fray, and now maybe they will be more cleanly sorted. But when I was reporting that piece for The Atlantic, I talked to Richard Stengel, the former Time magazine editor, who then went on to work in the Obama State Department, and he was saying that the Communications Decency Act should be amended in a way that demands social media companies do more aggressive moderation. Right. He was saying that we want more moderation, more, fact checking, that if they don't do that, then they shouldn't be shielded from liability. What the president is trying to do is get less moderation, but is also doing it by attacking or going after the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So my point is that the politics of this have been a little bit scrambled. And I think you see people on both the far left and the far right and libertarians saying that they don't want to see social media platforms exerting more editorial influence because doing that kind of thing is just going to make it harder for the free flow of, debate and information. I don't have a clean prescription for this. I actually can kind of see Twitter's argument that allowing the president's statements to exist on their platform is in the public interest, right? On the other hand, I think this particular tweet, it can very easily be read as an incitement to violence, not just from, the National Guard or the military, but you can see all kinds of people reading that tweet as permission or encouragement to, be violent toward these protesters. And so in that case, I do think that kind of tests the limit of the logic that Twitter is putting out here. But in broader terms, this question, and I heard you guys' conversation about this earlier this week, this question of how much fact-checking Twitter should do for the president is kind of beside the point to me, because I think that so much of the people who want this to happen, it's born out of a desire for basically a wish that the president wasn't the president, right? And to me, I think that the president of the United States cannot be meaningfully deplatformed. Taking away his Twitter feed is not going to shut him up. It's not going to limit his ability to put out these incendiary statements. He might just do it on Facebook. He might start issuing press releases from the White House making these statements. He might go on camera, he might go on Fox and Friends. He might, hold a press conference every day or 5 times a day. He has the presidential pulpit is very large, and he's going to have a lot of ability to say what he wants to say. And, I think that the debate about how much Twitter should silence or censor or fact check him, it's not going to accomplish what a lot of people wish it would accomplish.
I think part of the problem, and David French has made this point, is that Twitter has already created a double standard for Donald Trump. They've allowed him for a long time to get away with things that they would hold, Twitter users with 200 followers who get reported responsible for. And those are people who could be deplatformed for saying and doing some of the things that the president does. So they've already created this sort of presidential exception for Trump. And I think what they're trying to do now is claw some of that back. The challenge, and we talked about this on the Dispatch podcast earlier this week, was that if they're doing this for President Trump, they're going to have to do it for other world leaders, other significant American politicians, what have you. And those double standards exist as well. And we've now seen them. Going back on Wednesday, we talked about statements that had come from leading Chinese diplomats suggesting that the United States was responsible for creating and basically planting the coronavirus in China for it to spread. And those were not fact-checked in real time. Now Twitter has started to go back and fact-check those old statements. But think about the mess that creates for Twitter. I mean, think about how many erroneous statements currently exist in the Twitter feeds of, everybody. I mean, journalists who were way over their skis on what Bob Mueller had. Other things that the president has said, things that the president's defenders have said. They can't realistically go back and fact check all of Twitter. It's sort of crazy. And I think the biggest problem with this is it's a totally ad hoc process. They're pretending that they have these standards and principles. Right. Twitter is, and it's manifestly untrue. I mean, somebody should fact check that. It's not true. They're going back and making up the rules as they go along. And I think that's what's getting him in trouble. People have to know what to expect, what's permissible and what's not, how they're going to be treated. And Twitter's failed that way.
Well, they're absolutely making up as they go along. That there's no question about that. The question is what should they do going forward, right? I think the idea of retroactively, like that's just insane, right? But going forward, what standards are they going to apply? You could see a world where they say, we're going to do some limited fact checking and moderation of just world leaders or just heads of state or, just government officials or something like that. You could see some kind of situation like that. But I think that we're not saying what the real thing here. And so much of this debate avoids this reality, which is that Twitter could just suspend Donald Trump. They could delete his account. They don't want to. And the reason is because Donald Trump makes Twitter extrememely relevant to the national political discourse, right? There's a reason. I mean, clearly with all the pressure they've received from the left, from probably the majority of their, users, I'm sure that they could have just made the decision, well, let's just boot him off. He's violating the rules. They're not doing that because they know that it's not in their interest. If they remove the president of the United States, not only are you going to lose one of the most, the biggest content generators, right? The thing that the magnet of national and global attention to their platform, they're also probably going to lose a lot of the president's fans who are going to leave in frustration, and maybe they'll go to another social media platform. They're just trying to figure out a way to still allow for this to happen while also making small concessions to critics of the president. And you're right that it's just it's been a mess so far, and they're opening themselves up to a much bigger mess going forward, I think.
So here's the bigger mess that I see coming, McKay, and it goes to your past life and mine as well, which is the presidential campaign. It is not, what we're experiencing now in terms of a presidential campaign will not be what it is in September. Mm-hmm. It's about to be far more consuming, both of reporters' lives, media lives, but also just regular people. The post-Labor Day advertisement blitz and just overall partisanship of the country starts moving after Labor Day. where people really start identifying with their political parties, at least as we've seen every 4 years in the past. I don't see this being different this year.
Yeah.
And so whether it's Twitter or Facebook, social media, this disinformation that you point to, and we saw a little skirmish of it with the two videos, one put out by the Biden campaign and one put out by the Trump campaign, both of which were sort of deceptively edited, and how those were treated. Is this current conversation we're having in May, almost June, what is that going to look like in September when we're talking about the stakes being higher for a lot of people, more videos from each side and the sort of tit for tat? Well, you took down this video, you fact checked this tweet, but Biden said this thing, and we want that video taken down. And is that going to just contribute to the polarization that would ramp up anyway?
Yes. But I also think each individual instance will matter a little less, because everything is going to be so much noisier and so much crazier that, it'll be hard to focus on any one story. But I do think, look, you're right that this is my third presidential election that I've covered. Like, every presidential election gets really, really nuts in September and especially October, right? I don't even want to recount all the parade of horribles from October 2016. But Sarah, you and I were talking throughout that period. That was an intense few weeks. So
it was weird. It was weird.
So the answer is, I think that the public square is going to get a lot noisier. It's going to get a lot more vicious. We are going to see much more, I think, disinformation, both foreign, but especially domestic. That's part of the reason that I wrote this piece, is that we have been so focused on foreign disinformation since 2016. And I think the much more potent, force in our politics is going to be domestic disinformation, whether it's coming from political parties or campaigns or all these kind of shady groups. That's going to ramp up a lot in September and October, especially as people feel like they can pump things into the bloodstream without being held accountable before the election. This working of the rest that you're talking about it's already been happening. It'll be happening a lot more, especially because I think President Trump has made a calculation that it's good politics for him. I remember Jonah said on your show earlier this week that he's not clear exactly why it's good politics for him. That these constant eruptions, kind of away from where most voters actually are focusing their attention are. It is strange. I think it is worth challenging the conventional wisdom that that's good politics. But for some reason, the president's made this calculation. The president's son, Donald Trump Jr., who I've also written about a lot and reported on a lot, has kind of made this his hobby horse for the last couple of years. And it's part of the reason that he's such a folk hero to the kind of online MAGA right, taking on big tech and accusing them of censorship and bias toward conservatives. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of culture war drum beating as we get closer to the election. I'm frankly less worried about what it will do to the social platforms. These are very wealthy, big companies that will, they'll do fine. But I am worried about, just the further erosion of our kind of collective trust in any kind of American institution. And I think we'll see a lot more in that vein as we approach November.
One quick follow-up to that. What advice do you have to a young McKay Coppins out there covering their first presidential campaign in 2020 with all of this background?
So just be my real advice is tweet much less than I did in 2012. But honestly, just be careful. And this isn't just a young reporter coming up. This is, all my colleagues. Be very careful about what you see. I have a policy of I do not retweet or weigh in on viral videos for at least a day or two after they first start to go viral. And that's because we've just seen so many times now that some kind of thing video will go viral, and then additional context comes out and we find that, oh, it wasn't quite what we thought, or it was still, it was, but also we missed this side of it, or in the worst cases, actually this is completely misleading. And, I just think that I think journalists, we need to be really careful, because there are very savvy operators out there who are going to deliberately try to trick us and deceive us and mislead us. And in part to drive their own agenda, and sometimes just to make us look bad. They'll try to get journalists to fall for something so that then they can turn around and say, look how stupid these journalists are. So anyway, just be careful. It's dangerous out there is kind of my advice. And we should do as much as we can not to contribute to the noise, basically.
Steve?
It's good advice. We will be sure to copy that and send it to all of our youngins.
Steve, I know you wanted to talk to McKay in particular about our youngins, but also the overall project here.
Yeah, of course. I mean, journalists love to do nothing more than talk about journalists and themselves, and I think
people
most people find that.
To it. I think no, people love it. They love to hear people in the media talk about the media. It's
So
their favorite.
I know you're being sarcastic. They like it more than I thought, honestly. I mean, I would go, when I would go give speeches, whether it was to Rotary clubs or business groups or conservative movement groups or whatever, I usually went out of my way not to spend much time talking about the media, because I've been sort of obsessed with the media for as long as I can remember. I gave a speech in 1988 in the Wisconsin State Forensics Championships about media bias. So I've been sort of obsessed with the issue forever. And I didn't want to.
That was like a weird, humble, but also really nerdy brag.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean it as a humble brag. I should have just said a forensic speech in 1988. You're not going to ask me how I did. You're not going to ask me how I did. You want to know my score, my exact score? So I've been obsessed with this.
No, that's weird, because I think you have the medal like right behind your head. Like, I can see you still have it framed in your house.
False.
Over the mantelpiece where your children have to walk by it every day.
I left it with my parents. They were very pleased with it. So I was always worried, in giving these speeches or talking to people about this, that I was kind of projecting. This is something I'm very interested in. So of course everybody else is. And I guarded against that impulse to talk about the media much. And then, really as we've seen this kind of democratization of the media, and we've seen this explosion of sources, you started to see, or I started to get many more questions about the media itself. People did want to talk about it, which was really surprising to me.
I think you're right.
Go ahead.
I just want to add quickly. I remember my editor at BuzzFeed, Ben Smith, who's now at the New York Times. He used to always say, even like right when he hired me, that all politics is media. He was saying political candidates, politicians, elected officials, they're all kind of their own media, mini media outlets, right? And so much of the debates we have about politics are also debates about media. And it's not a surprise then that Ben Smith went from being a longtime political reporter to now the media columnist at the New York Times. Right. He basically sees those beats as heavily overlapping. But anyway,
and Jonah had a very good column about this the other day, pointing to a piece of direct mail that he'd gotten from the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign basically, I think, I'm again paraphrasing, but started this direct mail piece saying something to the effect of, we're not running against Joe Biden, we're running against the media.
Right.
And I mean, as a matter of descriptive reality, that's more or less true these days. And I think most of the sort of anti-Trump right it just uses the media as a deflection mechanism. They don't want to talk about this crazy thing the president said. They'd rather talk about the media and how it's being covered. Now, there are some very, I think, legitimate critiques of the media that people on the right have been making for years, and there's a reason I think that this kind of anti-media talk resonates as much as it does, frankly. Anyway, that's a long sort of digression, wind up before we get to what we really, really want to talk about, which is us. So,
as the famous Toby Keith song said, I want to talk about me.
So you did a piece about the Dispatch for the Atlantic. I don't remember exactly when it was, a few months ago, and you're here on our podcast. So obviously we didn't regard it as a hatchet job. I think it was fair to describe it as it was a fair piece, but skeptical piece. Is that do you accept that description of it?
I think I was skeptical not of the enterprise itself, but of the market for it and kind of where it would fit in the broader media landscape. That I had questions about it that I raised in the piece.
So here, I mean, it's like you teed this up perfectly. Here's one of those questions. This is what you wrote. One could be forgiven for wondering whether the incentives in conservative media can actually support a project like the Dispatch. Have audiences on the right simply been conditioned to expect validation and nothing else from their news? Fair question. I think the skepticism is fair. I mean, you went into some of the history of the kinds of media outlets that have been launched like this, and they've either sort of changed their focus or haven't succeeded. So my question to you is a very simple one. Are we doomed?
I thought you were teeing me up for like a told you so. I thought you were going to pull out the subscription numbers and start reading them off to me.
We're off to a good start. We're very happy with the start. That's for sure.
No, I mean, look, I think that one of the reasons I wanted to write about you guys was because I do think it's really important that there are conservative publications and outlets that are rigorous and, upholding conventional journalistic standards, right? Like that. I am not somebody who thinks that that is the province of the left or the center exclusively. Like, I think that there need to be more serious, rigorous news publications on the right. And so far, I think that you guys have held to your mission statement. Like, it seems like you're trying to do what you set out to do, and you haven't followed the Daily Caller drift, is what I would call it, which was, it started out with a lot of the same rhetoric as you guys and ended up in a very different place. I mean, maybe we should check back in 5 years and see where you're at. But
there's the skepticism I was looking for.
No. But here's what I will say. I think that the media industry in general is shifting in a way that actually is potentially more conducive to the kind of project you're doing. By which I mean, there's a lot more emphasis on subscriptions and a lot less advertising emphasis.
Yeah.
And when the whole thing, when all of digital journalism was premised on how can we get the most traffic and the most eyeballs so that we can sell more ads and make more money from advertising revenue, that did create some bad incentives, right?
Yeah.
On the more the more benign end of things, it created, SEO incentives where you're trying to game Google's algorithm with dumb headlines. Like, the famous Huffington Post one was they would always do every year a story that was headlined, "What time does the Super Bowl start?" Because they knew that millions of people would Google that. And so they would, get a bunch of traffic. But then in the more, sinister side of things, there was, it incentivized conspiracy theories and incendiary headlines and, race baiting and all the rest. And the fact that now we've shifted, that model just basically didn't work. That I think almost every digital news outlet has started to realize that you can't sustain a serious newsroom or a growing media outlet with advertising alone. And so the shift towards subscriptions, which, by the way, The Atlantic has also followed, it creates an opportunity to identify an audience that wants what you're doing, that may be center right, but also wants more than what a lot of the conservative media is offering. They want new information, they want fact checking, they want context, they want thoughtful essays and commentary. And so if you can identify that audience, it doesn't have to be 25 million people. You don't need to be drawing tens of millions of people to your website every day in order to just, pay the bills. You can identify a small but loyal audience and charge them for what you're doing, and it can be successful.
5 million members would be fine. We would be happy with that.
Well, I was actually about to ask you, I do think the question I still have is, how much do you want to scale this, right? Like, do you see this as kind of a boutique outlet that is well respected and well regarded and doing good work and is, profitable and working? Or do you see this as, the I don't even know, the New Yorker, the center right New York Times? Like, do you want to see millions of subscribers? Like,
this is the danger. This is the danger of asking you questions about this. Inevitably, you were going to turn this around on me, right? There was no other. I should have seen this coming. There was no other way this was going to go. You were going to find a way to put me on the spot.
Wait, you didn't invite me on to ask probing questions about your business model? That wasn't the point of this podcast?
No, I'll bite. I mean, I think what we would like to do is offer something that is certainly different, I think, than what many places on the center right are doing. Not everybody. I mean, it should be said there are outlets on the center right that are doing really good reporting.
Sure. And I tried to give some props to those in the piece. You're not an island by yourself.
No, not at all. I think we want to start small, build a loyal audience, and we're open to growing. We don't want to. What we didn't want to do was try to grow quickly by doing all the wrong things.
Right.
So when we may have told this story before, but when we were going and looking for investors, and we sat down with some venture capital firms, we did that enough and talked to them enough that we ultimately decided that we didn't want to take venture capital money, because venture capital firms are making lots of bets and they want hockey stick growth. And we thought the kind of things that we would have to do to get the kind of hockey stick growth that our investors would then have wanted would have compromised the editorial integrity of the project. So we didn't do it, and we decided we weren't going to take venture capital money because we weren't going to do that. So we want to grow. I mean, I think there's a pretty big audience out there for this. I mean, they're certainly the early returns are encouraging, both in terms of non-paying readers and listeners, and in terms of paying members. We think that there's a lot to build on. We think there are a lot of people who still don't know what we're doing, and sort of broadening that reach will help us convert a lot more people and make them loyal readers. But I think the key to it all, this is not rocket science. The key to it all is to do good work, do good, produce things that are different from what a lot of other people are doing, and to do it well so that people are willing to pay for something they value.
And we are almost out of time with McKay, but lest anyone think, McKay, that all of your pieces are these, deep philosophical, investigative thoughts on perhaps the right or the Trump administration. I just flew. It was worse than I thought it would be, was one of my favorites. But my favorite piece is the stockpile of food in my garage, which was this wonderful, personal look into the life of McKay Coppins. You are Mormon, and part of that culture is to have food on hand. And it was this wonderful piece, actually, that I highly recommend, because it goes to like your view of your role in your community, that, you should be a source of comfort to your neighbors in a time of crisis, like the beginning of the coronavirus. But here's my question to you now, several months later, after that wonderful, thoughtful, inspiring piece. Have you pulled out any deep tracks, if you will, in your stockpile or in your pantry that you just never thought you'd get to?
Well, okay. So I will say we have not cracked open the dehydrated bell peppers. We haven't gotten to that point yet in the pandemic. We had a bunch of water as part of that. I think we've tapped into that. There are a couple of like canned goods that we needed. We needed to eat because we couldn't get an Instacart delivery slot, in the grocery delivery thing. But we have not had to dig in too deeply. Thankfully, the doomsayers who said that there would be massive disruptions to the supply chain in America, that hasn't come to pass. So we've been able to stick to regular food. But it is a source of, the pieces about the comfort that comes from knowing that it's down there,
yes.
And I think that having the stockpile, while it seems strange to a lot of people, it does give me an appreciation for this kind of odd religious tradition that I grew up practicing.
I also happen to know that you have small children, and when I read about the dehydrated carrots, I was like, good luck to you, McKay.
I gotta say, my 5-year-old not banging down the door to have a dehydrated carrot snack.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, listeners, for being with us through this journey with McKay Coppins, wonderful writer at The Atlantic. Highly recommend all his pieces. And we'll just have to look forward to this one in the fall. We don't get any clues about what it's about, right?
No, but yeah, tune in August, September, October, and you'll see what I've been working.
Okay. So sometime later in the year with a wide range of dates, we'll have another big thought piece from McKay Coppins. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.